coming this afternoon to help us with our inquiry. We're much appreciative of it. Before we start, we're going to put on the broadcast now. If you don't mind introducing yourself, say who you are from my left, so we get it on record. If any of you wish to make any opening statement, please feel free to do so. If you don't, then we'll move on to the question, because we have lots of questions to explore with you. Can I start?
I'm Daniela Kellett. I'm the Forensic Services Manager for Lancashire Constabulary.
Good afternoon, I'm Carolyn Lovell. I'm the Operations Manager for Hampshire Constabulary.
Hello, I'm Dave Tucker. I'm the Lead for Crime and Criminal Justice at the College of Policing.
Thank you very much. I assume none of you want to make any opening statement. Okay, we'll go on to the question. If I might make a start. Now I want to explore three things with you, but is in relationship with the private practitioners and private forensic providers and in-house forensic providers. And is to explore how this relationship between forensic practitioners and investigating police officers and the CPS maintained. Are there ever any conflict? And also in relation to that, what input do forensic practitioners have in advising what types of forensic science might be most appropriate to use in a given case? And in that respect, are the forensic practitioners embedded into the investigation?
In Lancashire Constabulary, we insource about 40% of the forensic work that we do. So we have a drugs unit, a footwear unit, and a unit that does some of the biology, body fluids type examinations. We outsource all the analytical work, so toxicology and DNA profiling. Because the majority of the scientists that we use work in-house, we have quite a good working relationship with police officers, and we help to set the forensic strategy, advise them on what items can be examined, how to prioritise the work, and are fully involved. Usually it's the same scientist who will attend the crime scene right through to giving the evidence at court. So we have a kind of holistic view of the crime.
And in Hampshire Constabulary, we're similar. We probably insource about 40% of our work. We have got a number of partnerships within Hampshire Constabulary, so we also work with Hampshire Scientific Service, which is the county council. We insource all of our toxicology. We have drug experts in-house, and we have our own DNA screening environment, so we insource a certain element of analytical work. In respect to how we work with the police, we're embedded in the investigative locations with investigators, and for all levels of crime we set, very similar to Lancashire, we set our forensic strategy with them, either as a forensic practitioner, submissions manager, or the crime scene manager, depending on the crime type really, and we set that direction straight from the start of that particular case.
So obviously from the college perspective, we don't have a link directly with the operational delivery of services at crime scenes. But what we would seek to do is that we set the training structure and set the national policing curriculum. So we would seek through the curriculum and through the learning standards that we develop to create those links so that investigators know what to be looking for and how they can then liaise and work with crime scene investigators, just so that there's a whole proper coverage of the investigative process, of which obviously forensics forms the part.
Okay. Yes.
And a follow-up
Jones.
question. None of you, or neither of the two ladies, mentioned what you do when you've got digital evidence, which is key to the investigation, which must surely be an increasing part of any modern crime scene. So could you say, because it doesn't seem, you didn't mention that as being in-house.
No, so it varies across the UK. In Hampshire, we've got our own digital unit, digital forensic group, and we do digital work, but it's not the same across the UK. Some digital units sit outside of scientific services or a forensic unit. I don't know what that's.
Yeah, this is outside my portfolio, so they're a separate unit within Lancashire.
So where would you go in Lancashire?
Well, we do have a digital forensic unit, but it's not part of the scientific support unit. So we do most of the work in-house, and we outsource some of the more specialist work around CCTV comparison. But a lot of the stuff around recovering work from phones, downloading information from phones, we do in-house.
So in-house, The definition of in-house is in your department.
In
it's
the
distinct from
constabulary.
within the police.
Within the constabulary, but not in my department.
Whereas we're a little bit different.
Confused,
We
I
are
confess.
in-house, but there are also other units within the constabulary that will also be downloading phone material. So there are digital investigation teams, investigators, because obviously, as you mentioned, the demand is significant. So we have different kind of processes and triage processes in force.
Well, Thomas.
Some of the areas of forensic science, the expertise is largely embedded in the police, such as fingerprints. What work do you do for the defence? Not obviously in your own constabularies, but elsewhere.
I don't believe that we do any work for the defence.
I don't think we do either, but the defence will request to come in and obviously observe
No,
work, but we don't
advising
do
them.
any. No.
Can I ask the College of Policing what they do? It's fingerprints in particular, because there is a view that all the expertise lies in the police force. What do you do to help the defence?
Well, I mean, I think that there is the investigation is about gathering all of the evidence, whether it points towards or away from the allegation. So the work that the forensic scientists will do will form part of the body of evidence, and that is available either for the defence or the prosecution, and will obviously come out as part of the disclosure process. Clearly, the police resources would not be commissioned specifically by the defence, but as Carolyn said, that they can oversee that. But the position of policing is to do a fair and balanced and unbiased investigation. Then there is a decision about prosecuting, and then it sort of becomes partisan at that point. But the investigation should be an expedition to gather all of the evidence on both sides.
I would say as well that although my staff are employed by the police, we see ourselves as working for the courts as expert witnesses, so working for justice, not on behalf of the prosecution per se. So if we found something that was helpful to the defence, we would declare that, and that would be considered in our statements.
Thank you.
Okay. No other question? Can I move on to the next one, Lord Griffiths?
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about how you come to a decision as to how much you do in-house and how much you put out to the market, and what you feel are the risks and the benefits from each approach.
We've kind of grown organically within Lancashire. Some of the work that we don't do in-house, that we outsource, so DNA profiling, toxicology, is quite complicated to do, and there's also efficiencies of a scale. So to do it on a small scale for one force wouldn't really be efficient in terms of either turnaround times or cost. But the work that we do in-house, it tends to be work that we can do where we're assisting in the investigation in the early stages, so drugs analysis, footwear, fingerprints comparisons, examining exhibits to look for evidence. We do all of that in-house where we feel that it's quite useful to have that dialogue between the investigators and the scientists.
We're similar in that approach. We don't do any DNA technology or anything that's what we would class as a complex crime examination that would go to the forensic service providers so that they can provide the holistic examination of that item. We tend to take the approach that it's a screening tool to then work through a sequential process with some of our other units. So where we've got an opportunity for a DNA recovery and a specialist lighting or a specialist chemical examination, and to sort of put that process within a short time scale for the investigative needs, then we would put that in-house. But we manage that as part of the forensic strategy. So it would be managed on a risk approach as well around that particular criminal investigation. So if we felt that it needed to go to the forensic service provider, we would submit it to the forensic service provider for that whole examination.
Can I ask both of you, thank you for the answers, can I ask you, do you ever do a review every so many years of how much you are putting onto the market, how much you're doing in-house, and what the pros and cons are?
We've had a significant number of reviews over the last few years, and we're also part of a consortium of forces, so we're in contracts with the providers of how much work we can submit to them and what kinds of work. So that's reviewed constantly, both by us and by the contract management team, who are independent of Lancashire Constabulary.
We sit on exactly the same consortium, so we regularly review, but we regularly review on a yearly basis, but even current time. So how much have we got in our current providers? What are their current SLAs? And is that having an impact or is it not around our service delivery? So we're constantly focused on it. Primarily because the timescales around the courts have changed, so they're much shorter, and we really need to have an eye on that because it can place us in a significant issue in relation to getting our evidence to court. So we've really got a close view on it at the moment.
Can I just ask you one further question on that, and that is, when you have a scandal in a private provider, I mean, do you ever have scandals, for example, in the in-house providers? I mean, do you have sorts of things like that? If a private provider goes out of business, I mean, how do you rate the risks of those things happening, as opposed to the risk you'd have if they were in-house?
I think if there was, we've had obviously a couple of issues in the marketplace over the last years anyway. I think the two main risks for me are, first of all, there's a reputational risk to forensic science as a whole. So I think if there's a suggestion that there's some impropriety that's occurred in one particular organisation, I think it's often then becomes an issue for the whole country and all forensic scientists, so that there's that concern. Because the marketplace is so small as well, and there's so limited capacity, I think when there are issues and a provider is no longer able to provide that service, there becomes an issue around the speed that we can do the work, whether the work is actually, there is any capacity at all to do that work, which obviously then impacts on all of the criminal investigation.
Sorry, Mr. Tucker, I didn't ask you.
I was just reflecting that that we have had experience of this, and where there was national implications, and the national policing lead from the operational side took control of that and made arrangements to make sure that there was still provision in the marketplace, and that any issues that arose were that in relation to existing cases were managed. So there's a good network across forensics across the country, and there's capacity in the market to be able to sort of smooth out any problems. But I don't think we should underestimate the risks of a market-based approach to this. But then when you have if you only have single providers, whether they're public or private, the same issues still arise, that it can reduce the amount of flexibility in the system.
Especially if, say, there was a budget cut and you have to cut somewhere in the system, you'd have the same sort of problems about the profit margin being reduced in the private sector.
Lord Vallis and Baroness Young.
Tell us a little bit about the nature of the contracts with these private providers. Are they sort of one-off per job, or are they longer-term contracts which might give them a bit more security? How does it go?
I think they're over 3 to 4 years. So there are a number of forces, Northwest, Southwest Consortium, and we all bid together, and we agree. Well, each organisation which wants to be considered obviously puts in a tender where they'll agree their turnaround times. They have to be accredited to ISO standards, and they'll also offer a price for various products. So it could be that you pay a particular price if there was a case that just involved footwear evidence, or you may pay a different price if it involved different kinds of evidence. We then, as each force then commits to how much work they want to send of each different type, and we agree which providers we're going to be used. So it doesn't go to one provider, certainly not in our consortium. And then the work is parcelled out. So it might be that 60% of the work goes to one provider and 40% to another. And then over the 3 to 4 years, that price is agreed, the SLA is agreed. And if they don't meet those agreements, then they're subject to paying service credits to the force where they've failed to meet the terms of the agreement.
So they've got to be on hand for 4 years, as it were. But they're paid according to the volume of business and the price of that business over that period.
Yeah.
So it's conceivable that in a competitive setup where they're bidding against each other, that somebody could get nothing or very little.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Baroness Young and then Lord Mayor.
We've heard from other witnesses that there's been about a decade of price reductions, and that's impacted on the private sector providers. Can you, presumably since you're virtually in competition with them, you're also experiencing the impacts of that. Can you tell us how it feels right now about where the price level is pitched?
Do you want
I was just saying the price level is, I don't think they can go any lower, and I think there's been discussions around the fact that, and I saw the forensic providers here a number of days ago saying that they needed to have an increase in the market by 20 to 30% from the police, and I think it's probably at the lowest it can possibly be in seeing where they are. I think if in the respect of increasing it, I think from an organisational perspective, the impact would be we would have to then review what we submit and perhaps no longer submit certain aspects of our work to them because we haven't got any other financial, our budgets are being restricted, and again they'll be restricted again next year, so again we'll review what we do. So it's really quite tough, I would suggest, where we are now.
So are you at the point yet of worrying about quality and standards as a result of price restriction, both in-house and through the private providers?
I think the answer to that is no. I think we're, as part of our consortium and our plans, our reliance with our providers is they are an accredited service. They've both got some of them have got 17025 and 20. We're the same in respect of what we're currently got or working towards. So I don't think there's I mean, these things happen. We have non-compliances in those working environments. They do have an impact. But they happen anyway within a quality environment anyway. We've seen that happen.
I think when we've had budget cuts over the last 10 years or so, we've always, well, certainly the forces that I'm aware of, we've always ensured that we maintain the quality, and it will just be, as Carolyn said, maybe not stopping doing something, so we'll make an assessment, so it may be something that's seen as a less impactful crime, so something like a burglary that isn't in a dwelling. We may reduce the amount of forensic work we do in that so that we can focus on the crimes against the person or burglaries that are in dwellings and do more of the work in those areas. So it's more of a reduction of what we do rather than trying to cut corners in terms of the quality.
Lord Valens wants to come back.
Given that it would be pretty disastrous for you if one of these players was knocked out, or one of the big players, would it be a more secure deal to have, say, a retention fee for each of the big players and a lower price per volume of individual case? Because that would give them at least some kind of security for the future, which is, I think, the guarantee, or at least some kind of guarantee against losing one of them.
I'm not entirely sure how that would work because I'm not a business person. Okay. I know that at the moment there is a guarantee to some extent over the 3 years of the contract that we will submit a minimum amount of work to them. So there is some guarantee. There's no risk to them that we will stop sending work tomorrow. And that's part of the nature of the contract.
Okay.
Barrister Jones and then definitely Lord Mayor.
Pursuing for a moment what you were saying about the effect of cuts. From what I understand you to say, you believe that quality has not been prejudiced, though it sounds to me as if quantity has been. What about speed?
Yes. So at times when we've experienced our forensic service providers this year, where obviously we know that one's obviously gone out of business for a short period of time, that has had an impact on our turnaround times, because we've had to move our service to another forensic service provider, which obviously we have not obviously secured our service with them. So that's definitely increased turnaround times, and also other services where they have got limited experts in that area of business. Toxicology is one. So at the moment we're experiencing extended SLAs in respect of that, which obviously has a knock-on effects in relation to where we are with the court system.
Absolutely. I mean, do you have any? Can you give us any guidance as to what sort of typical timescale is and how it's being extended?
So a general sort of turnaround time is 21 days for a general case. For toxicology at the moment, we're experiencing 8-week delays.
Oh, wow.
In relation to our results to come back, depending on what they are. That's where we are currently with the information that we've got. The same for yourself.
Yeah.
Lord Mayor.
Can I ask about accreditation? Your views on the two ISO standards, the 17020 and the 17025. Now, Ms. Kellett, you've given written evidence. You've made your views pretty clear to us that you don't think that these standards are really fit for purpose. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I agree with the principle of accreditation, absolutely. But I think the standards, there's a clue in the name that they're not specifically set up for forensic science. So I think the 17025 is around testing and calibration laboratories, and 17020 is around bodies conducting inspection. So some of the aspects of those standards are quite difficult to evidence within a forensic environment, and because there's a requirement to evidence every section of the standard, sometimes you feel that you're almost performing a box-ticking exercise where you're having to comply with certain areas that don't seem relevant, and the balance of effort that goes into meeting that part of the standard as opposed to the bit that's around, are we getting the right work, are we conducting the correct examinations, are we getting an answer that's fair and balanced in support of criminal justice. Sometimes that bit seems to be a little bit lost in the weeds with the rest of the bureaucratic areas of those standards. That's my personal opinion. I don't know whether you agree, Carolyn.
In part, yes. I think there are definitely, in respect of implementing 17025 and working towards 17020, there is definitely a knock-on effect with the processes and the fact that it's taking more time. So even within in-house, our service level agreements are increasing because of some of those processes we're having to put in place. However, probably a little bit of a disagreement in the fact that I do believe that we do need some standards to professionalise our service. And there are a number of ways in relation to validating and being able to make sure that our tests are repeatable exactly the same as they are in the forensic service provider environment. So I think there is some positives in working towards that sort of national sort of perspective across our profession. But we are seeing, based on where we are in our organisation, because we are reduced in our resources, we are competing to deliver 17025 and 17020 with a backdrop of fewer resources and significant organisational demand. So it's creating quite an impact in trying to deliver it.
I think as well, because the standards aren't necessarily fit for purpose for forensics, there are a number of additional documents to provide clarity. So there's the codes of practice and conduct that the forensic regulator put together with a number of appendices. There's a specific appendix about forensic laboratories, and you find that you're having to meet a number of different standards, and although they're complementary, sometimes they're slightly contradictory, and sometimes they don't always fit with the legislation either, so it makes it incredibly complicated trying to meet the requirements of all the different standards. And it would seem that it would be better if there was a standard that was specifically for forensic science and covered the issues that were relevant for forensic science, rather than trying to shoehorn us into something else.
Is that what you're recommending? Is that what you'd like to see?
Yes.
The impression we have from the evidence that the written evidence that we've seen, and also from what you've just been saying, is that the whole business of accreditation is rather patchy and not very satisfactory.
Yeah.
And what does that mean in terms of what we were discussing previously, in terms of the market? I mean, how is there a risk of privately run organisations not actually being up to sufficient standards with this rather patchy accreditation process?
I think the accreditation has been portrayed somewhat as if you've got accreditation, if you've met those quality standards, it minimises the risk of anything going wrong in forensic science. And I think although it helps to safeguard against something going wrong, I think you can never completely legislate against either somebody deliberately or accidentally making a mistake. But I think, in my opinion, some of the pressure that there's been in the marketplace is because they're, like us, having to align a lot of resource to meeting those standards and maintaining the accreditation. And for them, it's a requirement for them to be able to enter the tendering process. And I think a lot of the resources now are going towards that accreditation rather than to actually performing the science.
Can I ask one more question, Chairman? I think it's clear how the accreditation works for sort of analytical testing equipment. But how does the accreditation work in terms of the experienced forensic scientist who is offering a lot of interpretational evidence and putting it in context for the courts? How is the accreditation addressing that kind of skill?
Well, there's a requirement to demonstrate that somebody is competent, so you have to show what training they've had, what assessments they've had, but then ongoing competence has to be demonstrated, so they must manage a minimum number of cases. Every case should be checked by another individual who's also competent. They perform proficiency testing annually. In some areas we have blind verification as well. That's something that's a recent addition to fingerprint, because that's mainly based on the expertise of the individual performing the comparison. So there's now blind verification where the person who checks the results has no knowledge of what the original examiner did, so that we're constantly showing that transparently as possible that person's findings are valid and that they are competent in the field that they're an expert in.
Thank you.
Lord Valence, did you want to come back?
No, that's nothing.
That's fine. Okay, Lord Renfrew.
I'd like to ask about the forensic science regulator and what role you think she should have. The position's been running for about 10 years now, and I'd also like to ask you what statutory powers she should have. The government announced its policy 2 years ago that she should have statutory powers, but that's not happened yet. And how would that improve matters if there were those statutory powers?
I think that the forensic science regulator should have statutory powers, because it would give her some extra influential power to get from an ISO 17025 and the standards implemented, because obviously from a policing perspective, I think she would probably say that we've been slow in working towards those deadlines that she has provided. From an organisational department that is obviously implementing those, and around some of those challenging areas, particularly digital, I think we would like to see that the forensic regulator's got a little bit more flexibility in her approach around where we currently have got some significant demands operationally, and the fact that our resources, we haven't got the resources available to focus on achieving them. But I think she probably would say, based on the deadlines that were set, we should have been working towards them over the number of years. But the police as a whole have been, our budget has been significantly cut, and our actual demand is going up. So we're competing all the time to try to deliver it. But there is a real desire to deliver that accreditation and those timescales. So I think our feeling is we would like a bit of flexibility with her. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's also probably the background of the majority of the staff that I'm aware of in the Forensic Science Regulator's office currently are from forensic providers. So I think there's maybe not a full understanding of the situation in policing and the way that budgets work, the way that resources are allocated within policing, where we're not just a forensic provider, we've also got obviously numerous other demands on the constabulary as a whole and on the budgets, and I think there's maybe not so much understanding of how that works. But I agree that I think mandatory powers, and I think the lack of mandatory powers have maybe caused some of the delays in police forces achieving meeting those deadlines, because there's not really been any real compulsive driver to get them, unlike the providers who had to have accreditation to be able to enter the tendering process.
So it would be mainly a question of timing. You've been indicating that there will be a pressure to get things done more punctually. In terms of what gets done, or the quality of what gets done, would there be a comparable impact there, do you think, if she had statutory powers?
I think we've got a challenge, because if she obviously she needs statutory powers to enforce potentially. I think there are some challenges perhaps in the national landscape around where police forces are with accreditation, and I think around the flexibilities that is needed is if the police forces haven't reached them or are working towards them, what is the implication if they haven't got them? Because nationally, as I know at the moment, from a fingerprint bureau perspective, I think there are just under 5 fingerprint bureaus in the UK that have got accreditation. The timescale is now to be delivered. If the statutory powers are in and saying you're no longer able to do comparative work, what happens? Do we no longer do that work? Does it stop? Where does it go? So in respect of the flexibility, yes, we need it, but I think we're also coming from the fact she does need statutory powers, but what do they look like? The policing environment will be under significant pressure if it was the case that The timeline is now for fingerprint bureaus, but as you can see, there's only 5 there. There's also a number of issues that are competing around that, around the technical assessors, the experience within the UCAS environment, being able to get onto that timescale as well, to get into the police forces to assess us. So there's a whole demand, a bigger demand there too.
Thank you. Mr. Tucker, do you have any thoughts on that to add?
Just that the whole tenor of the debate here is, it seems to be that we've got to see forensics as part of the whole system, and that the principles that we must be adhering to, and which the college would be taking forward as part of the system, is around the integrity of evidence, and so that everybody can be confident that what appears in court is reliable. And this does go into the digital world. So we do some training around digital. We provide products for frontline investigators and so on. But one of the questions around the evidence now is the integrity of the evidence, of the sort of the dots and the dashes that come off a computer system, and how you accredit that and can be sure that that's the evidence that's going in court as well. So we need that. The principles are broadly similar, and we need to work together as part of the whole structure to make sure that there's an integrity of the whole system. And I think the forensic science regulator with powers needs to be part of that.
Thank you.
Morgan and Baroness Neville-Jones.
And you probably can't answer now, but I think it'd be helpful if you could write to us. You've several times said demand is up and budget's down, and I just think it would be helpful to have some figures around that, just so we understand the size of the issue that you're talking about.
Thank you. Please send it in to us, and that will form the basis of the evidence. Baroness Neville-Jones.
On the regulator, I suddenly have the feeling from what you were saying that it's not just a question of the powers that the regulator has, but also the advice that she's getting. Do you actually feel that she's surrounded by the right advice? I sort of rather caught from something that you said, that you feel that she doesn't necessarily appreciate all the pressures that the police, who are both providers and consumers of forensic material and evidence, I mean, that she isn't necessarily entirely au fait with the challenges you face.
I think the members of her team that I'm aware of are all from the Forensic Science Service or other forensic providers. As far as I'm aware, they haven't worked in policing, and although we're doing the same types of analysis and the same types of work, I think the dynamic is different in policing, and I don't think she maybe fully appreciates that.
Right, I see. Yeah, thank you.
Baroness Young.
Can we turn to the Transforming Forensics programme? Is it truly comprehensive? I mean, is it the answer to a maiden's prayer, basically, and it's going to sort everything out? Or does it leave other whole elements of the forensic services that it's not going to address, other gaps in what it's going to cover? So how confident are you feeling about it delivering, and how comprehensive do you believe it's going to be?
I think it could be. I think the Transforming programme has got the opportunity to transform the forensic landscape, but there are numerous layers of our forensic environment to address. So from a transformational perspective, if they align our quality environment, they align our training across all of our forensic disciplines, and we have a national body that will give that information, there is an opportunity there. But the challenge I think Transforming Forensics have got is, again, it's the competing demands that we've got in our own organisations against the changes that the police want to make around their own IT frameworks and platforms, and the fact that Transforming Forensics want to make some quite considerable changes that could be quite revolutionary, and we need that significant buy-in by our own chiefs, and Transforming Forensics need to be able to get in and deliver that, and I think there's been some challenges around doing that. But I think if we had that and the platform was there, I think there's a real opportunity to nationalise what we do.
I think that the Transforming Forensics project, in some areas it's been a little bit too ambitious. So initially they were trying to aggregate forces into regions. I think that's difficult to do because of different budgets and different priorities in forces. So some forces may have a priority to deal with burglary, for for a period, and they may target more resources towards that. So I think that makes it difficult to have a sort of regional facility to deliver that. I think also because police forces are at different levels in terms of what they deliver in-house and what they outsource. So Hampshire and Lancashire probably have more in-sourcing than the majority of forces. There are some forces that only really do fingerprinting work in-house. I think you're not starting from a level playing field, so to try and get that consistency and that regional working would be very difficult without there being some losers as well as winners. But then I also think that they may be not ambitious enough in that I think the real critical issue at the moment in the environment is with the marketplace and the fact that we have private companies working on forensics with reduced budgets and all the issues that we've discussed earlier. And I think they maybe should be looking at what needs to be done around that marketplace. Where can we fill the gaps? Is a private marketplace even the right position to be in with forensic science? And I think they've probably, because of the steer that they were given from the Home Office, I think they've moved away from that and tried to look at policing, because they are a police transformation project. So I think there's some real opportunities, as Carolyn said, to get standardisation, but it just depends how far they want to go and what the appetite is, I think.
I mean, from a college perspective, we this is the transforming forensics is practitioner led. It's responding to the marketplace, and we're part of that discussion about how we can support that. And there does seem to be some opportunities in terms of developing sort of more standardised techniques, and the quality assurance might be simpler in that environment, and might release some resource in doing that. But it looks like ambition is the word that sort of struck me when I was looking at the paperwork for this. It is massively ambitious, and if there's a buy-in from the police service to do that, then the college, from our position around developing training standards, we would be supportive and give whatever help we can.
Okay, Lord Valens.
You mentioned that regions are presumably off the table at the moment, but both of you, I think, mentioned earlier on consortiums, that you were members of consortiums. Are they a sort of halfway house towards a region?
So the consortium is, I think it's 19 forces, isn't it? So 19 forces are in a consortium in respect of the forensic service providers' contracts. Mm-hmm. But regionally, there are different things that different organisations or police forces work with. So, for example, Hampshire work with Thames Valley Police. We've got bilateral agreements already in respect of our IT and other joint operational services with the police anyway. We currently are examining with Transforming Forensics a regional opportunity with TVP, Surrey and Sussex and Hampshire in relation to an amalgamation of the Fingerprint Bureau and obviously some of the processes that they want to deliver there. So it varies across the UK around what services have been regionalised and what haven't. But probably the most competing issue around delivering it is our IT platforms aren't aligned, and that's where we're trying to achieve currently.
Thanks.
Baroness Young and then Baroness Buller.
If there was an opportunity as a result of any review, including us, to give a view about whether we ought to go back to having a totally in-house state forensic service, either at a national or at a regional level, what would your response be?
Well, personally, in respect of obviously being working in an organisation for quite a considerable period of time where we had one, there are significant, we can see research has been diminished since we didn't have a national forensic science laboratory. We don't tend to look at things now on an organisational or operating level where there isn't actually the opportunity to do so much research around that. And we've lost a lot of our services in respect of other evidence types, so fibres, arson investigation, some of the more niche kind of expertise is gone because the market has been really focused on DNA, and we've got crimes and investigations that DNA doesn't solve. And so we still seek those experts, but they are in their minority. And obviously previously we used to be able to have those and look at a far more holistic approach to our examinations. So I probably would say I was an advocate for it in what I'm seeing currently.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I used to work for the Forensic Science Service some time ago, and when I joined, because it was a free service to police forces, there was a lot of waste in the system, I think, where everything was examined because we could do everything. I think some of that focus on best value and forensic strategies, I think was the right thing to do. I think that was absolutely something that should be done. But I think the position we're in now, where we have got that more of an oversight on what's worth doing, what's best value, what's going to give us the results we need in the case, combined with a national forensic provision, as Carolyn says, with niche examinations available, with some research and development in place, I think that would be a better system really than the focus on a sort of competitive market where there's profit margins to be made by the companies involved.
Baroness Manningham-Buller.
So be happy to duck it. It's really building on what Lord Valence said about regional hubs, consortia. Scotland has one police force. Do you happen to know how they do forensics? Do they have one centre in Glasgow or what?
They have one forensic service provider, but they have a number of labs. So I think they've got one in Glasgow, one in Edinburgh, and one in Aberdeen. I think. They've got local. Yeah, and they specialise in different areas. So one will specialise in chemistry, and one in DNA.
Thank you.
Lord Kager.
Turn to the question of research and that you've just raised. I mean, firstly, do you think that as things are currently organised, there is now a gap between the understanding of the coalface where forensic science has to be delivered and the research outputs of universities and those developing forensic science products in the private sector?
So I think Lancashire is similar to ourselves in Hampshire. I think on the back of obviously the journey that we've gone, Hampshire is in a partnership with a university, so we actually sit and identify our operational issues, and working with the university manage to be able to complete some research to address some of those issues. The issue around it from a national perspective is sharing that information. So we have been working over the last few years really to build a sort of network of universities to share that information with practitioners. And the Research for Justice, there's an opportunity to put your information on there so you can share with practitioners. But yes, there is definitely a gap around dealing what we deal with at the front end at the crime scene, and being able to continue with research that supports us. Definitely one of the areas that we experience significant issues now is the fact that the DNA technology is so advanced. We tend to experience mixtures in all work that we do. It's a significant increase, and the actual understanding of what that DNA means is really difficult to interpret in the courts and to interpret obviously within a police investigation. So that feedback and that information needs to go back to the forensic service providers so that we can obviously evolve that before we move on to the next technology, because it is having an impact on what we do.
And in terms of that research output, there are two issues. First of all, that collaboration you have with your local university, how is that funded and facilitated? Is it funding that you have in your service that initiates that research? Do they go and seek funding elsewhere?
So we would do joint bids with the university so that we join as a partnership, and we would seek bids as part of that innovative project, depending on what it is really. We've done Home Office bids to look at certain research. We've worked with the forensic service providers to put some of their technology within our front-end services to say, does it actually work? And trialled a number of other things within our environment. So our 17025 laboratories and processes, it's allowed us to do some research in those environments. Yes, the police do fund some of it, very small amount, but tends to be bid orientated with the university.
And in terms of the dissemination of that, the practical dissemination of the research findings, how would you propose that that's done more effectively to train forensic scientists?
So in respect to some of the research that we've brought from a personal perspective, we've published. So we've published them in scientific journals or police journals, so that could be disseminated in the professional community. We've also gone to the respective forensic science conferences to deliver some of that working practice so that it obviously can be cascaded. And we publish it within the new network within the Research for Justice. But that's new. That's been sort of developing over the last 12 to 18 months.
Sorry.
No.
And do you find that the volume of research output, its quality and the ability to disseminate the research has diminished since we've moved away from a national service to this more market-based approach?
Yes. So I would say personally, as a practitioner, I would try to seek and continue looking for my own professional development to see what those changes are. But I think previously we would get sent quite a lot of that information around some of that work activity. We'd be sat on working groups within our forensic science service to try and deal with those issues and progress them and move them forward so that we can work within them, within the criminal justice system. We don't tend to do that anymore.
And do you think there's a way that we might be able to objectively demonstrate that change in terms of the research culture between when there was a national service and the situation today? What might we look for by way of evidence for that? Published output, or I mean, how might one go about demonstrating that objectively?
The only way I could think of that you could maybe look at demonstrating that would be if you looked at the output in terms of scientific papers. So there's a journal that the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences produces, for example. I think when the Forensic Science Service was in existence, many of those papers would have been written by people who were working at the Forensic Science Service or sponsored by people who were working at the Forensic Science Service. I think now you'll find that there are a lot more research is done in universities. A lot of it is also overseas. And I think it's maybe a lot more of an academic nature rather than a practical nature. So it's not necessarily something that we as practitioners, it's not answering a problem that we have or an issue that we want to address. It's more from an academic point of view. But I'm not quite sure whether you'd be able to quantitatively demonstrate that the change.
Yeah. Okay. Lord Valence and then Lord Thomas.
I think you've almost answered my question. I was going to ask, is there an international dimension to this research, and where is it? Is it the United States? Is it Europe? How big is it?
I know that there's a lot of research that goes on in the United States. Some of it is within universities and some of it is within their forensic provision. And also in Europe, there's the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes, and a lot of the member organisations of that organisation will do research. I think it does seem to primarily be universities and academic bodies now rather than law enforcement agencies, I would say, particularly in the UK.
Okay, thanks.
Lord Thomas.
Very brief one, and not for answer now, but would you be able to help us by references to specific branches of forensic science as to where there were advances in the period up to privatisation and what has happened since then? I mean, you've mentioned fibres, you mentioned DNA, but there must be other areas. Footwear, I notice one of you is a specialist in. Would you be able to sort of try and give us, by reference to specific aspects of forensic science, you know, where the advances are not being made, which they were being made? Not now.
Okay. It's just the college is in, you know, we would find difficulty with the scientific base of this because our research is mainly around sort of more in the social sciences. But in the social sciences area, we do have a What Works Centre for Crime Reduction where we publish academic research so that we can show what works and what doesn't work. With the evidence-based policing is central to what the college does. And I just wonder whether there's something to learn from that area, but I appreciate it's very difficult because there isn't a similar sort of policing-orientated scientific community that could take that forward. But maybe it's a conversation that we could have outside of here about how we might be able to support that. But as I say, our expertise and our researchers tend to be more on the social sciences side rather than the scientific sciences.
That's not to diminish them. They may be equally important.
Of course.
It's just whether there's, to follow on from Lord Thomas, if you just mentioned fibres, it would be quite worrying to this committee, I think, if there were a string of these things where there's been no further progress, whereas you judge there is the potential for progress.
Yeah, I think if you look from an investigative point of view, particularly cold case review, and you'll be going back to those type of evidence types. We do, and it will be fibres that may well, I'll pick fibres, but fibres may well solve the job over DNA. We take a holistic approach in relation to our forensic gathering at crime scenes, but if you look, you probably could look at the diminishing number of experts over the years when DNA has been advanced. They've probably petered out during that particular time period, but the evidence is still compelling when we need it, but the experts just aren't there.
Well, the question referred to Lord Thomas, any evidence you can send us would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. Baroness Little-Jones.
I'd like to ask a question about training. Mr. Tucker, when the College of Policing, last March, it ceased to provide forensic training, you said, and I'm quoting here, we've been working with the Forensic Portfolio and Performance and Standards Group to develop a sustainable solution for future learning, development and delivery. Could you tell us what was the background to the college's decision to cease providing that training itself? What is the group that you refer to? Who composes it? And how well have things developed since then, if these are the people who are now taking the issue of training forward?
The college undertook a review of all of its training delivery, and we want to contribute only in places where we can add value and add a unique value. What we were finding with our forensics delivery was that many forces were not taking up our forensic training delivery, and those that were finding that our products were insufficiently targeted at their particular needs. As you listen to Carolyn, that they talk about different structures and different ways of delivering services in each force, and there are collaborations in some places, and so we have a 43 force structure, and the college trying to do one sort of monolithic training delivery was frankly not working for the customers, and so we took a view that we should step out of it because we weren't delivering what was required. What we then did was we worked with, so the group you referred to is a subgroup of the forensics portfolio of the National Police Chiefs Council, and we worked with them.
What does that mean precisely? Sorry.
So the National Police Chiefs Council has a number of business areas, and then underneath that you would have forensics as one area where there'd be a national policing lead. The Chief Constable of Dorset is the current national policing lead, and then underneath that you'll have they have a standards group, and we are very closely working with them to make sure that the structure around training and standards is robust and delivers what the marketplace needs. So we work with transforming forensics across the whole range of areas to make sure that, as best we can, there is a training provision that meets the needs of the marketplace, that the training standards that are applied are what's required to maintain the integrity of the evidence going before courts, and that we support the competence of individuals so that the accreditation process can take place.
And how is that work getting on?
Well, there are more providers in the marketplace than there were when the college was the provider. There is a feedback loop that works with the forces because the responsibility for competence rests with the forces. They have to be assured about the competence of their practitioners, and they have to be assured about their own competence as a structure. And obviously UCAS have a role in making sure that all works properly. So we are not aware that there is a problem with the training provision. But if there were, we would work with Transforming Forensics to try and solve that, and to try and make sure that the training provision is what is required by the marketplace, supported by our learning standards.
So what is the relationship between Transforming Forensics and the lead Chief Constable and his group?
So the lead Chief Constable is leading the Transforming Forensics work.
I see. So it's one and the same thing in practice?
Yes. Yeah.
I see. And so what sort of authority do any conclusions that group might arrive at have in relation to all the constabularies?
You have, this is the same across every area of policing. You have 43 chief constables, you have chief constables and other chief officers in charge of particular aspects of policing, trying to take things forward. So you have a crime committee taking things up. And they work through through the Police Chiefs Council and gain agreement to take things forward. So there is a very strong sense of cohesion, I would say, around transforming forensics. There is a sense that that things are needed to go forward, but you will still have to get 43 Chief Constables and the Police and Crime Commissioners to support any work that you want to take forward that will have that national implication.
So can a Chief Constable of a given constabulary decide not to follow whatever the guidance is?
Yes. Yes,
right.
And that's the same. That's the same in every area. There is a well understood operational independence of every Chief Constable, and there is a local accountability through police and crime commissioners, and there is a structure that the College of Policing sits centrally within that. We are a completely separate body from operational policing and from police and crime commissioners. We set standards in other areas. We don't in forensics because of the existing structures that are there. We feel that if we were stepping into that, we would only be duplicating and not adding value. But we set standards in other areas. We write the guidance around domestic abuse, how you investigate missing children, and so on.
You mean we the college?
The college, yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I see.
So the college sets standards in most areas of policing. We don't in this area because of the existence of
forensics have become something of an exception, have they, to what would normally be the case in the college's role in setting standards?
Yes, there are other areas. Mm-hmm. Please don't ask me to give you examples, but there are other areas where that would also be the case. Yeah. So we want to set standards in the areas where we can be effective and add some value to the process.
Can I ask you, do you think the situation is satisfactory?
Are you asking all of us? Or?
No, well, I mean, yes.
No, I'd say no. From a forensic perspective, there are absolutely right, as David said, that we've got some courses that we can license and deliver, and we're currently delivering one in Hampshire at the moment. But if you look at some of the other forensic courses, now we're all going out delivering it ourselves. So and David's right. Some forces wouldn't have necessarily gone to the College of Policing, might have been based on the location, so there were other courses that were accredited, but now we're kind of like in a sort of disparate sort of, well, where are we going to go? So from a fingerprint community at the moment, we don't know where we can go, and certain things are popping up to deliver it, but there's some real issues there around what is the current standards nationally, and police forces are then currently looking at their own needs and delivering their own needs in their police service rather than taking the national aspect. So moving forward, we do need some sort of central governance around forensics and that training so that we are all delivering the same standard, and looking at what the future looks like. Transforming forensics looks like they are the platform to deliver that, as in the current issues, and they're trying to understand those, and quite rightly 43 forces have got completely different standards. They've all got different needs as well depending on where their experts are. And we now need to consider what the future looks like for those individuals, and plan ahead for the different technologies that we're trying to implement. And that needs to be taken into consideration because we're kind of standing still without it. And we're doing our own thing.
So if I try and summarise just what you've just said, it seems, it's from what you say, it sounds as if there is confusion about what constitutes best practice and the right standard. And secondly, there is going to be a difficulty about maintaining consistency of practice across police forces.
Definitely across police forces, because at the present time you've got 43 police officers delivering their training, looking at their quality systems, identifying and validating their processes. But what we might do in Hampshire might be very different to what they do in Lancashire. So somewhere we need a central sort of governance around what we then deliver nationally, and we haven't got that. And
do you reckon that has an impact on what happens in the court?
I think because it's only recently that the College of Policing stopped having that oversight, and I think they were setting the standards and suggesting what best practice was. I think there's still some consistency at the moment, but I think there's a risk that we're already starting to divert. There's some divergence between different forces. I think although police forces all behave differently, have different demands, different pressures, different political agenda, I think the way that forensic science is examined in the first instance is generally consistent. Some of the processes might differ slightly because of those pressures in the force, but I think the way that CSI would perform at a scene. They may recover different items depending on what the procedure is in their force and depending on what the budgetary constraints are, but the actual way they'd recover them would generally be standardised, but I think there is a risk that that will start to diverge as we have more providers and there's no oversight.
What, if I might ask just one last question in relation to what in all of this is happening to work on digital forensics and the resources devoted to it and the priority
So
it's given?
It will vary.
As Manningham Buller is going to deal with it.
Apologies. Apologies.
I think it will probably vary across the police forces depending on where the digital forensics groups sit. Definitely within our scientific services, we are looking to increase our staff within the digital forensics team, and the organisations are looking around digital investigators out within a policing environment, and the triage and kiosk processes and cybercrime. All of that is an increasing domain. The challenges that we have around keeping on top of the technology, because the technology changes so swiftly within the digital environment. And also it's the retention of staff, because the private sector is very engaging in taking our police staff investigators because they have a higher salary to pay, and so we are trying to manage that as well. So it's quite a competitive market for them.
Manningham Buller, did you?
I think you've answered most of my questions. We started with this subject too at the very beginning we had the digital thing. I mean, if you've described things that are pretty familiar: shortage of skilled staff, inability to retain, technology galloping ahead of you. You're all trying in different ways to deal with that. Is there a national solution to that, which it would look to me obvious that there might be? Notwithstanding the independence of the 43 chief constables.
For digital forensics?
Yes, because of the complexity and the speed of change and the fact that getting and retaining the right skills, both in the investigations and in the forensics, is going to continue to be very difficult. Is it not?
Yes.
Or am I leading you? Yes, I am leading you.
No, I think you're right though, and I think certainly in terms of the speed with which the technology is developing and the ability for us to respond to that is something that could be managed nationally. The issues around the development of technology are the same in every one of those 43 police forces. But I think with both traditional forensics and digital forensics, there needs to be a combination of a national governance and some national delivery, but also local delivery. So as Caroline mentioned, the kiosks give you a quick answer if there's anything on a mobile phone or a device. They can give that quickly into the investigation. Some of that is more appropriately done in the police force, whereas the more complicated investigations as part of a more serious crime could be done nationally or regionally, I believe.
Can I just make one? Because I think that's really key, is that there are digitally enabled crimes, that are at the top end, like sabotage and cyber attacks, and that will always require very high levels of expertise, and that's where you're most likely to see new techniques emerging. And as time passes, they sort of pass down the pyramid and become more mainstream. And so we need a process, and we're working with the National Crime Agency around how we do that, how you move what are very secret and sophisticated techniques now, and spotting those ones that are going to become sort of more routinized in the future. So there's that. But you also have those types of crimes which will leave a digital footprint. So your burglar going into a scene may not leave anything other than the fact that their phone has communicated with a router or something. And those are much more sort of routine things, and those will always have to be delivered locally, and it will require greater nous. So at the college we've got training products which help at the front, particularly at the front line, for people to develop those skills so that they understand the opportunities. So we do a thing called digital media investigators, who are like tactical advisors, and then we do a suite of training courses for frontline officers, trying to get them to obviously to equip them so that they understand what the issues are. But the speed of change is really massive, and so we're going away almost now from delivering a training product to start going into things which address much more around tradecraft. So as things develop, rather than trying to do a whole training product, we're doing something that's briefing, because we know that what we know about one particular application today will change tomorrow. So we need to be much more nimble. So we're reviewing the whole of our digital offer at the moment to try and look and make sure that whatever the college is offering is up to date and meets the needs of all of those different markets.
Lord Wallace, you had a quick question.
I've heard from earlier witnesses that one of the problems on digital is actually volume, terabytes of information to go through, and that a lot of this is looking for needles in huge haystacks, looking for individual words, individual names, and so on and so forth. Wouldn't that be better handled by a national bulk processing unit?
Well, I suppose it depends on where the request comes from and how quick you need it to happen. I was very closely involved in all of the developments around disclosure. One of the key issues there was the amount of data that courts were asking for from policing to get at very, very short notice, and there is now there are a couple of trials going on to try and use artificial intelligence to try and do those searches through mechanical means. So in theory, all of that could be done by a central setup, but it would require the investment and the agreement of all the forces to do it. And it would also critically have to be responsive to the needs of forces, and and the needs of forces will vary. So in metropolitan areas, you might very well have a much greater need for digital evidence, because there's just greater coverage in metropolitan areas than other areas do. So getting that balance right might be a challenge.
Okay, Baroness Young, did you have a? It's covered. Well, I think we've exhausted the time. Thank you all very much for coming today to give evidence. If you, on reflection, think that there might be some answers that you might have given more details, please feel free to write in, and that will be evidence, written evidence. So thank you for coming today. Very much. We'll start.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
We're just starting the broadcast. I thank you, all of you, for coming this afternoon to help us with our inquiry. And your contribution clearly is going to be very important to us. Before I start, it would be helpful if from my left, and although I know who you are, if you don't mind introducing yourself for the record, and then if any of you want to make an opening statement, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll move on to questions.
Thank you, Lord Patel. My name is Julie Maxton. I'm the Executive Director of the Royal Society, which is the National Academy of Science. My background is in law. I read law and was called to the bar at the Middle Temple, and have spent much of my life as an academic, as a professor and dean of the faculty, and as a practicing barrister. The only other thing I'd like to say, sir, is that I will speak in two capacities, if I may, as I put in two responses to the consultation. One was on the programme of work that I'm leading at the Royal Society, and the other is a task I've been set by the Permanent Secretary of the Home Office, which is the Science and Justice Forum, which I'm doing in my personal capacity.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Andrew Renison. I'm here on behalf of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, where I'm a commissioner. I should just point out to the committee that before that, I was the Forensic Science Regulator for 6.5 years.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Emily Bolton. I'm the Legal Director of the Charity and Law Practice, the Centre for Criminal Appeals. We are a law practice that specialises in investigating and litigating suspected miscarriages of justice. In my previous practice, I worked in the United States, which has a very different regime for access to evidence, including access to evidence for forensic testing. And since coming back to this country and seeing how it works here, I'm appalled. I think forensic science has an enormous amount to teach the system about itself. And unless we can identify mistakes, we can't learn from them. And if we don't learn from those mistakes, the innocent remain in prison and the guilty are left free to commit other crimes. So the work of this committee on this issue is absolutely crucial. I can only bring a lawyer's perspective to this. I think it's a lawyer's worst nightmare to be on a panel with scientists. But any questions in that area I would welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. If I might start off, and the question really relates to the provision of forensic science to the criminal justice system. And the two-part question is, one, is the criminal justice system being equipped with robust, accurate, and transparent forensic science? And is a difference in the forensic science provision provided to the private sector compared to the public sector?
Would you like me to begin? Certainly.
Or should I say prosecution and defence?
Sure. Well, perhaps I can have a go at the first part of your question, or your first question. Clearly, there is a lot of forensic science being used in the criminal justice system, but only a small proportion of cases that get to court use forensic science. One could conclude from that the forensic science is good and exculpates people or facilitates a guilty plea. Or you could conclude from that perhaps there isn't faith in forensic science. And I suspect there's a lot of truth across the whole spectrum. But I would say that there are clearly some cases where some difficulties have arisen with the use of science in the court, and particularly with the use of statistics in the court. And there has also been a growing concentration on the calibre of forensic science, particularly over the last 20 years, and particularly through the work of the Americans in from the National Academies, the National Research Committee of the National Academies, who did a report in 2009 which exposed some of the frailties in traditional forensic science. And I think, again, in 2016, the PCAS, the President's Advisory Committee, did another report on that. And these difficulties, I think, are reflected across the world. I would say that a lot of these difficulties come from advances in science. So we now know that many techniques are not scientifically robust, and of course I think we need to address that. And in addition, of course, science is changing all the time. Science is a method, and appreciation of the method of science is really important in making sure that science advances in pace with its understanding across the whole spectrum of stakeholders in the criminal justice system.
So the answer to that is both yes and no. I mean, if we take our minds back to the Runciman Commission in '93, the Royal Commission on Criminal Justice, there were serious concerns expressed then about the quality of science and forensic science, and that led to a number of changes, and we saw some improvements in the system. But one of the recommendations of that commission is that defence advocates should have access to reliable, transparent, robust forensic science. And I fear we're moving backwards in that respect rather than forwards even now. And I think there's a real issue with the legal aid cuts are cutting off access to forensic science to defence advocates and I guess really to some of the applicants that appear before my commission. However, in other areas I think there's very robust supply. The commercial sector you referred to does supply some very, very, very good and speedy products to police investigations. When I was the regulator, I referred to it as coalface forensics. So the officers investigating the burglary, the rape, or whatever would get their DNA result within a day or two, or within 12, 24 hours if they wanted a speedy response. And that's what should happen. And that doesn't happen in many other places of the world. I went to a research lecture or research meeting in America about 5 years ago, where the Americans were proud of the fact that their best crime lab could turn around DNA in 30 days. The mean turnaround time across American crime labs at that time was 126 days. In the UK, we're doing it in 2 days, day in, day out. But there is, and I think you've already heard this, a huge risk growing around this, and I saw the evidence given by the three gentlemen from the laboratories. And that risk is to do with the huge cuts in money that is going in their direction. So when I started as the regulator in about 2008, there was probably £120 million being spent on forensic science. That is now down to about 50 or 55 million. And the huge risk that presents is a collapse in the market, and with little or no contingency plans that I've seen in place. So it's yes, no, and huge risks hanging around it at the moment.
Thank you very much for that.
Our experience, we've had about 1,000 applications for assistance since we opened our doors as a charity offering free legal services. And what we see in that pool of intake, we've only accepted a very small number of those cases, around 20 to 25. But what we're seeing is that access to the original source material to be tested is uneven, so whether physical or digital, obviously because it's in the custody of the police. And I think that whether the defence don't end up doing that testing due to funding issues, as Andrew mentions, or due to just general sort of inertia, is a question. And also, there is not, compared to the United States, there is not a culture of defence investigation, and that includes forensic science investigation in this country comparatively. So where the defence do gain access to something that they can subject to testing, it may be a poorer quality copy. So if you're looking at digital evidence, you may be using looking at a copy rather than a clone, copies of digital evidence that lack metadata. So, and you would have to fight to get it. And, you know, I'm really here to tell you about the reality on the ground. Like, there are many rules around this stuff and accesses that are written into the statutes, but the reality on the ground is that the defence is really basically relying on the work of the prosecution and the police because of the cuts that we're talking about and because of that lack of cultural tradition for investigation. The only other comment I would make on Andrew's reference to the speed of DNA turnarounds is that those turnarounds are obviously amazing for an evolving investigation on the ground, but that evidence always, those findings of a match or otherwise, always need to be contextualised within the circumstances of the case. What they actually mean depends on who was where, when, and what they're saying about that. And so while you may have a super fast match, no match situation, who is there to take responsibility for the interpretation of that from the beginning to the end, from the gathering of the evidence to its presentation to the jury? That is crucial. That's the decision you're asking the jury to make. You're not asking the jury to decide, is this a match? You ask the scientist to decide that. But you do need to help that jury and the judge in preparation of the summing up with an interpretation. And speed is one thing, but depth of understanding and clarity about context is also absolutely crucial and is missing.
Baroness Morgan.
Can I just ask you about the level of understanding within the criminal justice system? So thinking about lawyers, judges, juries. In previous sessions, and I know in the seminar we heard about the importance, there's a bit of a breakthrough that the primers provided in the sense of people coming together and producing something that everybody could work from. And I know you've got the Science and Justice Forum as well. What I struggle to understand is where are they going in a sense? So should there be a statutory basis for the forum? How does the work of the forum move forward? Where do we find out about it? Because when I heard about it, I confess I immediately thought, right, well, I'll look at the Home Office website. It's not there. So where would any practitioner, let alone a jury member, know to find that information? So big step forward doing the primers, but how on earth, A, where are they going next? And secondly, how can that information be disseminated and supported going forward?
All right, well, thank you very much. The instigation for the primers actually came from Lord Thomas about 8 years ago after the Royal Society concluded some work on neuroscience and the law, which was called a Brainwaves Project. And he later referred in the Calisher lecture to the importance of having something like this. It was a challenge which I gladly took up, given my background in law and finding myself in the Royal Society, and managed to persuade the Council and the President, Sir Paul Nurse at the time, to agree with me. And of course we do the primers with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I know that you've had colleagues from there in front of you. So it was a challenge for us, but we've got it off the ground, and we've got a steering committee with judges from both sides of the border and scientists from both sides of the border, and so we're going on. We've done 2, as you know. We have another 2 in preparation on statistics, collision analysis, and we've got ballistics and scientific testing of drugs also on our list. In order to do the primers, I raised money from a foundation in America, and we have...
So they're not funded from the Home Office?
No, the primers are not funded from the Home Office. To be fair, they had nothing to do with the forum. But in addition to the primers are one part of a programme that I, with colleagues at the Royal Society, have developed. There are other parts to it. We've done over the last 4 years 10 seminars on a variety of topics, for example, memory, statistics, neuroscience, pain, substance addiction, genome editing, causation and causality, and robotics is just coming up. And these seminars bring together judges and other practitioners in the legal field and scientists to discuss areas of common interest, because of course both law and science pursue the truth. Much of the lexicon is the same, but its interpretation often differs. In addition to that, and I will answer your question, in addition to that, I've been talking to the judges who run the Judicial College, and have managed to get one of our best statisticians to speak to 160 judges during their continuing professional development, as it were. I've had another one speak to them on substance addiction, and we've got 2 more coming up where they're going to be speaking to 160 judges on both occasions. In addition to that, I've also taken the opportunity to make sure that the college in its lecture series includes science, and we've had fact and fiction in brain imaging, what makes a decision autonomous, and techniques of DNA analysis. So this is all part of a programme. This has had nothing to do with the Home Office. Right. The primers we've done together with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, but the other ones were just an initiative from the Royal Society. So to answer your question, and if I could come to the Science and the Justice Forum, it was set up about 2 years ago against a background of the Chief Government Scientific Advisor's forensic report. And in that report, he challenged policymakers with what forums should provide the opportunity for discussions between different participants in the justice system. And I think perhaps this was a pilot to see whether it might work. So the forum was set up at the request of Mark Sedwill, who was then the Permanent Secretary in the Home Office, and I chair it, but it has scientists on it, it has Ministry of Justice, Home Office people, judges, prosecutor, defence solicitor, the forensic regulator, forensic practitioners, and the police. And I might have missed some, I don't think I've missed anybody out, but it's a complex stakeholder base, and the idea was that we could facilitate better communications and we could horizon scan for the issues that were concerning the community. So to answer your question, I mean, I could talk about the challenges that we've come up against and describe a function that might work. But the form, I think, would have to follow the function in order for it to work properly. So would you like me to go on?
I would certainly, while recognising time and all the rest of that, I mean, I think that would be very helpful, because it's been clear to me in previous sessions, this is kind of good practice, but where does it lead to, and how does it fit into the system? So a suggestion of how something more proactive, if you like, could help would be helpful.
With your permission, Lord Patel, I shall go on?
No.
No?
I've got the problem we have is we must get through the lots of questions we have.
Right.
The brief and succinct answer you gave, the better it is, because it gets recorded.
Okay.
If you have detailed information, we can always have that subsequently in writing. So focusing the answers to begin with, on the questions asked would be helpful. If there are subsequent evidence that you like us to have, we'll welcome it, but it might have to be in writing subsequently. Okay? On that basis.
On that basis, I would like you to, if that's all right, but I would like to know how you think, what would the form of a suitable body or approach be?
All right, so I think there are 5 challenges.
Yeah.
I think better communication, a strategic approach to research in the area, education both ways, scientists and lawyers and judges. Funding is clearly a key issue, and the changing nature of science has to be appreciated. Having said that, I think a coordinating mechanism could support research and development from blue skies to application, could enable collaboration and communication across science. It could horizon scan for emerging issues. It could increase investment, and it could influence areas of need.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Sorry to be hard on you.
Is the idea actually standing body? Is that what?
Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, it could be. I think in the work I've been doing with the Science and Justice Forum, there are different models that could be followed. You could follow something like an institute, like the Turing Institute. You could put it to a university, like the migration work that's being done at Oxford. You could make it a public sector research establishment entity. I think there are a variety of approaches one could take.
And that's not been decided.
Oh, it's not for me to decide. No. We could simply say...
What you're saying is there is a need to look at the possibility of a national body that might have appropriate representation that may take this work forward for the future on a long-term basis. Mr. Renison and Ms. Bolton, do you have anything to add?
I would simply add that approach obviously is laudable, but lawyers will always be amateur scientists, and ultimately the testing needs to be done by professional scientists, and unless the access to the evidence is there and the funding is there, that won't have applicability. So the primer teaches us to know that we want it, but unless we can have it, for the CCRC to have the funding to be able to commission experts to do the work, and for individual would-be appellants to have that access and that funding, you've just offered us something that we can't actually fulfil.
Okay, Baroness Young.
Give me your verdict on the degree of leadership being shown in all of this by the Home Office.
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
Going back to the previous question, I think there's two very exciting developments, the primers and the forum. I think we need to watch that closely. It's how we take them forward. I think the big gap in this at the moment is absence of any real strategic thinking. And I don't think the fault for that lies directly with the Home Office. I think it's the Ministry of Justice as well. And I think the two ministries should come together to resolve that issue.
And is that part of the problem, that there are actually two departments?
As part of the problem, I think the bigger problem is just funding at the moment. Yeah. It's the cuts to funding across forensic science, whether it be through legal aid on the Ministry of Justice side or policing on the Home Office side.
Thank you.
Lord Valence.
Quick one. On education. Shouldn't those who wish to be barristers in the criminal courts not actually have to have part of their education in forensic science and be part of their qualification?
I think barristers and solicitors should be so much more aware than they already are of the potential for forensic science to resolve cases swiftly. Absolutely.
So part of their formal education?
I'd be happy with that.
Why not? I think squeezing it into everything else they've got to... we had these discussions with the Judicial College, do we call it now? Many, many years ago, and they just really struggled to fit anything into the with everything else that had to be done. But there is certainly a gap there that needs to be filled with some further teaching.
I wanted to ask you about disclosure.
Yes.
Your former chief executive identified that the largest single cause of a miscarriage of justice was a failure in disclosure.
Yes.
And it's surprising that he identified this in 2012-13, and I think he's right in that time. This is a long-standing failure. Why, in a corresponding period of time, in civil cases, most disclosure is done by, in large investigations, by keyword searches, use of artificial... Why? What's the answer to the question? Why haven't the police invested in this? It seems... I simply don't understand why they spend hours looking at documents when a machine will get it better than they certainly... and secondly, once you've made the investment, it should be far cheaper. Why haven't they done it?
I think it comes back to this lack of strategic thinking again. I think people have neglected to look far enough forward. But the civil courts have, but there are people addressing this. I was at a demonstration 2.5 weeks ago at one commercial provider where they've got a tool they've brought in from America that does exactly that. It will just suck everything in any format. It'll take PDFs, it'll take photographs, it'll take data off the internet, whatever format you want. It can then index it and sort it, and you can then do exactly that. You can do the keyword searching. And I know they've trialled it in one large fraud trial where it was in court, where anybody could search there and then and see if anything relevant cropped up. So the solutions are emerging. But I don't think it's brand new technology. I think it's been sitting there for a while.
No, my real question is why, considering this is all old hat, and the problem's been known about, and it's causing miscarriages of justice, why hasn't someone put some money into it? Why hasn't the Home Office invested in the police? You don't know.
I could ask the same question. I can only put it down to a lack of strategic thinking, because I think the strategy has been too focused on a small part of forensic science. I think it's taken its eye off the ball elsewhere.
You've concluded?
Yep, that's all I want
Lord
to ask.
Griffiths missed you out. You had a question.
Yeah, well, it is just on the previous question. It was really who at present is actually funding the Science and Justice Forum?
There is no funding, sir. I'm doing it.
But
yes, but the Home Office are doing it with us. So there is some leadership. They did set this up actually, and of course they're supplying some of their staff. But I'm also supplying a colleague of mine to do it.
So it's the Royal Society and the Home Office?
No, it's not the Royal Society. I've just agreed in my personal capacity to accede to a request that Mark Sedwell made to me 2 years ago. But it has no funding, so I'm proposing to write a letter back to him with recommendations of how this could be taken forward. But we're not quite at that point yet.
Thank you.
Okay. Lord Oxborough.
Yeah, at various stages in this inquiry, the name of the regulator has kept popping up in all sorts of different positions, and it seems to be a little unsatisfactory at the moment, insofar as the government has indicated that it supports the concept of a regulator for forensic science, but hasn't done anything about it. There is a private member's bill being put forward, and the government hasn't opposed it, but doesn't seem that interested in pushing it forward. Looking at it from your point of view, do you see a need for a regulator? And how would it actually improve the situation over what we have at the moment?
Well, the obvious answer for me is yes, I do see a need for the regulator. I was that person for 6.5 years. And very early in my tenure, I took discussions back to the Home Office about statutory underpinning of that role, because I saw some problems emerging through people failing to buy into the standards that the majority accepted were required. I've had exactly this debate at 2 House of Commons Science and Technology Committees. I had assurances from the Home Secretary, I think in about 2012, that there would be something on the statute books. I'm still waiting, so I'm incredibly frustrated by that, and I know that Dr. Jill Tully is as well. And the private members' bill, frankly, I don't think will make it through the Commons. So I think we're back to square one on that, and I would please encourage you to make further recommendations on exactly that issue. You know, I don't think the argument is whether we need a statutory underpinning or not. I think it's when is it going to happen, and just exactly how is it going to happen.
I mean, what powers would you give to the regulator?
I would like the regulator to have powers to seek information in areas where she's investigating complaints. I would like the regulator to have power to issue perhaps enforcement notices if she sees areas of real grave concern. That's not far, I think, from what's in the private members' bill at the moment. I think also some clever thinking around the primary legislation that would create powers for the Secretary of State to create standards through secondary legislation, so to speed things up so that as and when standards are agreed through the process that works very well at the moment, they could then themselves have some statutory underpinning as well through secondary legislation.
She would become an enforcer of those standards?
Pardon?
She would become an enforcer of those standards, or
the way I would see it working is the enforcement process actually happens through the accreditation process, where that's appropriate, because the standards are set out by the regulator. To prove you achieve those standards, you go through an accreditation process, which doesn't work for every situation. You know, there are people out on the niche of all of this that perhaps it isn't appropriate, but for the bulk of laboratory work, it's a standard that works very well, and accreditation is the way of testing that. And I can give you a very long answer that explains exactly what accreditation achieves, but it actually covers some very, very crucial areas that then reassure the criminal justice system that the product is worthwhile and is safe. I think the enforcement notices would be an alternative function, i.e. that if, albeit there might be accreditation in place, as we've seen in some recent examples, the regulator could go in and say, yes, I accept that's happening, but I think there's more needs to be done. Bearing in mind that United Kingdom Accreditation Service can walk in now and they can withdraw someone's accreditation. That can happen now. And I've seen threats of that, and it makes people move quite quickly.
Okay. Either of you two have a comment?
You've all got experience of the systems that work in other parts of the world. Do all of them, or any of them, have regulators?
The UK was the first. America followed with a committee, which fell out, I think, of some of the work of, I think we mentioned was the NAS report, and I gave evidence to that committee probably about 6 years ago, but that's since been disbanded.
Right.
So I think this is pretty new territory globally.
Right.
The two of you have any comments on the question?
I think that one of the points that perhaps gets lost in this is for both forensic scientists doing their work or regulators doing their work of regulating forensic science is that they can only come to a good decision on the basis of the evidence in front of them. And if you don't have adequate recordation, for example, of transcript to know what a forensic scientist has been saying to juries, and that you can't compare that from one case to another. In the United States, you've had the right of transcript since 1956. Any felony, any crime that carries a sentence of a year or more, there's been a complete transcript of the trial available. And that has been vital for essentially almost like the self-regulation of forensic science, because the scrutiny that an expert comes under when he or she appears in a subsequent trial, if I was cross-examining that expert, I've read every time that they have testified on this issue, and I am checking whether they're moving with the science, whether their position has shifted justly, or whether their position is shifting in a way that is perhaps slightly troubling and suggests that it has more to do with who they're working for than where the evidence is leading them. And so you've just always got to keep your eye on what evidence is coming in to the regulator or to the forensic science. And unless the system is prepared to show us the evidence, as the regulator, as the scientist, as the lawyer, as the jury, you won't get the best outcomes that you could get from this tool.
Sorry. Baroness Morgan, did you want to ask a question?
No, that's fine.
That's fine. Okay. Lord Mayor.
I think my questions are for Dr. Maxton. Wearing your two hats, really, your Royal Society hat and your Science and Justice Forum hat, about research. And I think you mentioned earlier that there needs to be a strategic approach to research and more effective coordination of research funding. My question really is, who do you think should be responsible? Indeed, who should be accountable for ensuring high-quality research in forensic science?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer who should be responsible, but I think that one of the things we have done in the Science and Justice Forum is map the research landscape in forensics, and to see where the money is going, where it's coming from, and where there are gaps. And we're doing some end-to-end case studies on different forms of forensic evidence. So we've been looking at, as I mentioned earlier, that you could have different structures for playing this out. But one thing we have talked about, and I noticed that the Public Accounts Committee mentioned it, which is OSCA, the Office for Strategic Coordination in Health Research. And it would be possible on a kind of mini OSCA basis, if you like, to take a strategic view, but I completely agree that a strategic view is needed, and to sort of urge funders into certain areas. That said, there probably needs to be another funding stream for the, of course, with commercial providers, that dictates certain behaviours, and often science evidence is needed in areas that are rare, and so one must look at a different funding landscape. So, but how I would also agree that the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice will need to be heavily involved in this. I mean, confidence in the justice system is an essential part of our societal stability, in my view, and the fact that it is at this state, and it's not only in forensics, but it's widely known, it's across the justice system, that the cuts have been really very heavy over the last few years. And I think this is an area which the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice could really take leadership and suggest which kind of body might be the one to take it forward.
And do you feel that there are two sort of categories, I'm sure there are more than two, but two major categories of research? There are the new technologies, the advances in facial recognition, digital, all the rapidly moving digital research techniques, and then separate to that are the interrogation, the interpretation, the social science almost as much as the hard physical science.
The recognition
and how that's all presented and behaved and understood. Do you think does UKRI have a potential here? Because these are forensic science has been described to us as being an orphan discipline. It doesn't belong anywhere. And do you think that UKRI might, in its new coordinating role, be of value?
Well, certainly. I look at forensic science as the forensic, to me, simply means that science that is presented in the courtroom. And so it could come from anywhere else. Certainly there are the categories you describe, but DNA and the scientific underpinning of DNA came from more, different forms of science. And of course, one doesn't know where the science is going to evolve and how it's going to be used in a courtroom setting. So I think UKRI, if it were minded and had the ability to fund some of these strategic needs, and one could take the areas of research interest of the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice as a starting point, and look also at strategic needs. I mean, certainly the judges in the Science and the Justice Forum, they have views on what the strategic research needs are. And I think the whole community needs to come together to think about the strategic direction.
And it does seem that research was more productive, more forthcoming under the forensic service that did exist. Now that's no longer. We're hearing that there's less research done, and it's more reliant on universities.
Oh, certainly. Many universities, I mean, we discovered as we mapped the landscape, many universities work with individual police forces across the landscape.
Can I perhaps help a little bit as well, Lord Chairman? I think the picture is a lot more complex than we're making out here, because there's huge global issues here as well. So forensic science is a global science nowadays. Crime is global as well. So we have to be good at tapping into the potential for research in America, across Europe. You know, there's been some huge European partnerships in terms of research in forensic science. Lausanne and other universities have been perhaps at the heart of that. But we mustn't forget also the bottom-up approach. There's a lot of very good work happening right at the ground level, individual police forces with their local universities. So I was at Bournemouth University just last week, where they're telling about collaborations with Dorset Police. So you've somehow got to capture all of that and nurture all of that. And I think we've just got to be a little bit guarded about taking a strategic top-down approach, because I think you'll miss the real richness of a lot of the stuff that's going on at different levels already, not forgetting the global picture. So the real trick, I think, is recognising everything that is going on, even if it's in the biology labs, the chemistry labs, the data science labs that have nothing to do with forensic science, and milking from that the new technology and the new sciences that can have real benefit in the criminal justice system. Over to you for that challenge, but that's
I would completely agree with that. I wasn't suggesting a top-down approach. I just think we need to supplement what we've got, and there's lots of good practice around, lots of good initiatives, but we need a space where these can be communicated, and we need a space where they can be supplemented.
And the question really, going back to the point about strategic direction of research, or the strategic approach to research, is it's all very well having lots and lots of these different bits going on in all sorts of different police forces and universities, but are we hearing you say that there is ideally a need for some sort of body, I'm not quite sure what that body should be, to be able to pull it all together and really have a strategic approach?
We looked at this to some extent when, excuse me, I jump in there, when Bernard Silverman did his review, I think it was 2015, I think it's been referred to, and one of the answers we came up with then was actually to have a really informative forensic science conference on an annual basis, because in the science world, conferences are a fantastic place for picking up on other people's work and ideas and seeing it presented. And there's a sort of peer review process that kicks in with that as well, and presentation of posters. And the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences did take up that challenge and have had some very, very good conferences. And they had one just a couple of weeks ago. And I think they run them on an almost annual basis now. But when Bernard and I were looking at this, we had in mind the likes of the conferences I used to go to in Australia and America, where they were huge. You know, you had 4 channels of information that you could plug into over a 4-day conference. And the amount of information and new learning was phenomenal. And I think that's probably part of the answer to this, is a UK European-wide conference on a regular basis where the new sciences, the emerging sciences, at whatever level it's operating, is presented and made available to others.
John, can I have one last question in relation to the subject? Is it your perception that the funding for research has also been cut in recent years? So there is actually less research going on because
I don't know what's happened in the research councils. We were always assured that the money was still available, but there's always a battle to get the funding out of the research councils. You know, there's nothing new there for the universities, the researchers. There's no doubt that the Forensic Science Service did spend a good chunk of money on research. I mean, there was one particular piece of research that really excited me when they were closed. You know, it was all around probabilistic fingerprinting. That's just gone. We've lost it, and it was a crying shame, I think. The current commercial providers do fund some research, but it's more aimed at validating the new methods they're bringing on board. It's perhaps bringing on board the new sciences that have come from elsewhere, such as the new DNA chemistries, the 17s, the 24 chemistries. So research to validate those in their laboratories, in their hands. So I think the answer is that there's not as much being spent as there was when the Forensic Science Service was around. If the Forensic Science Service was still here, I doubt they would have the money to spend on it now.
And would the funding for research best come from, more funding from research, that is, best come from the Home Office or from the Ministry of Justice?
Both. The research councils, the police, everybody with an interest in seeing positive outcomes from research.
Okay,
and the police do fund some, but it's very small amounts.
I think the orphan discipline remark, I think, brings out the problem here, which is that those areas of forensic science which have come unstuck somewhat spectacularly are typically the ones that are operating in that orphan area. They're not DNA, they're fingerprints or ballistics. Areas where the only reason you have a forensic scientist doing it is because they believe that it is valid to look down a microscope and see the number of points of comparison on a fingerprint or look at tool markings. The areas where the science is only for use in court, I think, are the ones where the research and the scrutiny is most needed, because they don't get that natural external testing from a medical context or other applications of that strand of science.
But Lord Chairman, they would do through the accreditation process. And that tests exactly those issues.
Yeah.
In the document that the Royal Society compiled about where the research is being done and who's doing it, did you find anything in terms of funding, etc.?
This is under the Science and Justice Forum.
Yes,
yes, we have. We do know where a lot of the funding is coming from. I mean, some is coming from EPSRC, for example. There's some funding coming from European sources. There are lots of different, but they're small generally. Biggest source that we've discovered is the ERC, the European sources. Yeah.
Okay. Lord Renfrew.
Could we shift the focus for a moment to digital forensics? And we've been told that the ratio of spending on traditional forensic science versus digital forensics is about 6-1, which seems a notable imbalance. Is enough being done to prepare for the important and increasing role of digital forensics in the future, do you think? And does the criminal justice system have the capacity to deal with the increased evidence load that digital evidence generates? And I wonder if you could say a word about cybercrime. We've discussed it previously, on previous occasions we've talked about mobile phones and so on, but it isn't just mobile phones for digital forensics. I think the field is perhaps a wider one.
Well, the short answer to that question is no and no. there's certainly an imbalance. My view is the only area of forensic science that has seen any growth in the last 5 years is digital, because it's been forced upon us with the explosion in the use of mobile phones, computers, sat-navs, the whole digital arena. And it is lagging behind. There's got to be a massive investment in that. Dr. Tully will say that the whole process is lagging behind in terms of standards as well. And I'm quite shocked with how tardy some people have been to take up the standards I was asking for 5 years ago in the digital forensics arena, because I'm still not convinced we know some of the methods are valid. I'm not convinced we know that people are truly competent. I'm not convinced we know that the organisations are competent to deliver the... So there's a huge amount to be done, both in terms of catching up with the huge volumes of work. There are now backlogs in the police laboratories for the methods that are for the work to be done. There's huge delays in achieving the standards. In terms of cybercrime, it's not an area I've ever looked into. I can't talk with any confidence on that one. My focus was very much on the hard forensics of telephones, computers, etc., which was the issue I was grappling with 5 years ago.
Thank you.
Well, there's certainly been an explosive growth in this area. There's nothing surer than that. Last year, more than 300 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute, for example, and 100 million images every day posted to Instagram. And, of course, it extends far beyond cell phones to all kinds of servers, iPods, GPS, etc., etc. I think it's not surprising if the criminal justice system is lagging behind. The science is going so fast, and the algorithms are developing so fast that it's widely realised now that some of the algorithms may have biases in them, and some of the algorithms may be protected commercially. And I think these lead to issues down the track. And in fact, in one of the seminars we convened at the Royal Society, which was on this area, one of the digital people said, I never thought about the ethics or the law, I was just interested in seeing what it could do. And I think it's really important to try and get that communication going as it's developing, otherwise we'll be in a catch-up situation.
And it is particularly international, I mean global, isn't it? Which makes it very difficult to grasp just from a national standpoint.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Bolton, do you have
From the perspective of, in the business of representing individuals, the digital explosion has essentially created 100% surveillance. So any individual should be able to, in a sense, defend themselves with their own data, if indeed it's there to defend themselves. If indeed it, points to an alibi or innocence or some other exonerating factor. It has enormous potential to reduce the factual disputes that come before the courts, because if you can get to that data, you can knock aside swathes, days and days of court time just by the hard data. But again, it's funding access to the material.
Okay. Lord Renfrew, have you any more?
No, thank you.
Sorry, Lord Thomas, did you want to go?
One question. Just as we use the word forensic science to encompass what is really science, such as DNA, and something at the opposite extreme, maybe the comparison of two types of shoe print, we use the word digital forensics to encompass huge amounts.
Yeah.
We've talked about one area earlier this afternoon, which is disclosure, which some people call digital forensics. Is there anywhere an analysis of what it is, are these different problems? There's the problem of facial recognition, which is one area.
Yes.
There must be getting, the use of, which you're not expert in, cybercrime, but is it possible to break down what is meant by digital forensics? And has anyone done it? Because we are actually using a label to describe many different problems.
Indeed, and these labels do get misused and misunderstood.
And I just wondered, has anyone ever, if you can't think of one...
No, I did. My specialist group, my digital forensic specialist group, probably 6-7 years ago, had an attempt at that. So I think in the regulator's office, there's probably some documentation that does break some of this down. Because you've got to really understand the scope of the problem before you can start regulating it.
That's all. If there is something there, that would be very helpful, because we talk in generalisations, they're very different problems.
But I think a linked problem is the term expert and forensic just get confused all the time, and they present two different problems.
Okay. Anybody else? No. Now, before I go to the last question, which is a very important question, and we would value each individual answer to it, I'm going to give you an opportunity for the next 5 minutes. If there are any areas that you think on reflection, any of the questions that you want to say more about.
Can I say something, please? In one of your questions, I think it was question 3, there was reference to a paper in Science and Justice, which quoted the figure of 22% of the cases they analysed where there was misleading evidence. Could I just urge some caution about the reading of that paper and what you take from it? Because I think that 22% figure is a little misleading. I think there's some good stuff in the paper. But if you're focusing on forensic science, I think the evidence in that paper around problems in forensic science actually presents a far less worrying picture. And it fits with work that was done back in the 90s and certainly by some of my colleagues in the past. And we see very, very, very few forensic science issues manifesting themselves as cases coming to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. I think what this paper that has been referred to in the question to us, actually, I think what it highlights more than anything else is the problems with communication through the system between the scientists, the police, the lawyers and the courts. I think there's some mileage in expanding that further from the paper, but just please urge caution on what you take from that paper in your reading of it. But I'm glad to see that I think one of the authors, Professor Ruth Morgan, is advising this committee, so she can help you with that.
Thank you very much. Either of the other two, on any of the questions we asked, if you want to enlarge. Now's your chance, Julie, because I stopped you earlier on.
No, that's fine, thank you.
Okay. Baroness Neville-Jones.
I want to ask you the rather unfair question in a way, but one which I think helps us crystallise our thinking, which is that when you look at the various issues that this investigation of ours has given rise, in your opinion, what recommendation, what single recommendation, that's what's unfair, but what single recommendation do you think would have the greatest impact in improving the quality of forensic science and at the same time make a serious contribution to the delivery of justice?
I can give a very simple answer to that. For me, it's funding upstream. I think money wisely invested very, very early on the coalface of forensics in understanding the science and all the issues we've been talking about. Invest that money right upstream, do it properly the first time, saves huge problems much further downstream. Particularly, I can see sort of a wave of work coming my way in the Commission further downstream if we don't do things properly and right the first time upstream. So it's funding upstream, where actually the funding is less than would be needed when actually you present all the problems a mile or so downstream.
Thank you.
I think that just summarises everything you've heard in this committee so far, actually, in terms of...
But perhaps the other two witnesses might have a thought?
Yes. Well, I would suggest a forum which would bring together all of the players in the system, tasked with making recommendations right across the piece to build on best practice, to say whether more money is needed and to develop a strategic direction, which I think would underline the importance of science to the justice system and the importance of the justice system to society.
I would say better access to the evidence to test it. The simple request that you show us the evidence.
Baroness Young, you have a question.
I just wanted to ask about the funding upstream issue. I mean, does that need to be accompanied by the forum that actually would establish a kind of national view of what it was important to fund upstream?
The forum is certainly a good idea, and I'd like to see both. Now, I think the funding is actually the police and the Ministry of Justice having the money to invest in legal aid, in spending proper amounts on forensic science. I was really struck by the evidence of the three gentlemen from the forensic science companies, and I hadn't quite realised quite how low some of their profits are and what the risks that's presenting. And that has led to police investigations not spending the amount they did on forensic science years ago, and we are losing some skills. You know, we've lost some companies already where some useful, valuable skills have disappeared. So I think it's funding in terms of forensic investigations, clearly research as well, but for me it's funding the forensic investigations upstream.
Well, thank you very much indeed. This session has been extremely